Oh, nice. Yeah, it's increasing. So it's my pleasure to start the last session of the day. We had several or many great talks, but we have two more. And these last two talks focus on ultra-fast phenomena, sub-100 femtosecond processes. The next talk is theoretical, and then we have experimental talk. So it's my pleasure to introduce Sergei Tretiak from Los Alamos, who will talk about transient localization and delocalization in molecular coherent energy transfer.
Thank you so much, Oleg. And let me start with thanking Johan and company for organizing such a meeting, because last year I was planning to be in London, but the times have changed, and we should be grateful for such a valuable gatherings where we can exchange our opinion and our latest research results. So by given the previous conversations in this workshop, I slightly tuned the subject of my talk because we have seen a lot of this flickering motion. I guess the notion of flickering polaron goes back to Johan, so that our wave function is undergoing sort of like expanding and contracting motion. And I will consider this perspective from the point of view of molecular coherent energy transfer. So again, this is an outline of my talk. I will talk a little bit about trajectory-based non-adiabatic dynamics, molecular dynamics, and I will introduce you to the two applications. The first one would be coherent passages through the so-called intermolecular conical intersections, which is very different from what we get used to intermolecular conical intersections. And then I will talk a little bit how we can model the spectroscopic probes that can be obtained at the X-ray facilities. Again, we are talking here about photoexcited dynamics when your wave packet is migrating through the manifold of the excited states, and we are trying to get something useful, such as light emission, dissociation, or charge separation. And on the way there is a flux of electronic energy into the vibration, and this flux sort of locally heating up the molecule, and we have a complicated dynamics when our excited states wave function is very alive. And we could see from those movies that we have a change of the spatial localization of the wave function, and we have the energy transfer events. This dynamics is beyond the Bonn-Oppenheimer regime, and as we have heard from many talks in this session, then we need to take into account the crossing between states, which are governed so-called non-adiabatic couplings. This goes through the several talks, and Iran presented a very nice overview of what we can do with such a high-quality method such as MCTDH. And in the next like a few minutes, let me overview what we can do with the trajectory-based methods, where we need to run necessarily the ensemble of the trajectories. The appeal of those methods is that by running the ensemble of the trajectories, those methodologies are inherently parallel, so that you could always use the bigger computer and to propagate the trajectories on the longer time scales. I will not go into all those details, but we have been discussing surface hopping, and there are a bunch of problems with the surface hopping, and it stems that by nature, the surface hopping is ad hoc method. We have been mentioning mean field Ehrenfest dynamics. Again, once it's not ad hoc, but you can derive it, but still the main drawback is a mean field, and you have problems, for example, like with 0-point energy, with breaking detailed balance. And I would like to make this point that all those problems can be fixed, whether those fixes can be some kind of empirical or semi-empirical or rigorous models. And this is what I called the surface hopping and Ehrenfest on steroids. And you could still get very, very meaningful results when you improve those methods, as you could, for example, see from the talks that are going through the course of this workshop. Also, I would like to emphasize in a little bit more details another trajectory-based methods, which would be multi-configurational Ehrenfest approach, which this method we have been used lately because it's controlled approximation. It's a fully semi-classical method where you could approach the exact answer, where you could potentially take into account tunneling, quantum tunneling, and zero-point energy. And here we are starting from the Ehrenfest-based trajectories and attaching to every trajectory a frozen Gaussian wave packet. So once we propagate it, those frozen Gaussian wave packets represent the vibrational wave function. And there is no discrepancy between the electronic part and the vibrational part. And of course, in theory, this method is can be made as accurate as we want, but in reality, this method is still subject how well we are sampling the relevant phase space. So, and when we are sampling the relevant phase space, of course, we are running into the limitation of the mean field, Ehrenfest. So that to lift this limitation, Shalashilin and Todd Martinez introduced this notion of the cloning. This needs to be distinguished from the spawning multiple spawning methods developed by Todd. Here, we have the Ehrenfest trajectories which are primary. And then once those Ehrenfest trajectory hit the conical intersection or level crossing, then we are asking the questions if the potential energy surfaces are sufficiently different so that it warrants that instead of a single Ehrenfest trajectory, we can continue with two Ehrenfest trajectory and dynamics will follow on. And I should emphasize that and refer you to this picture that Irene have shown when we have the dynamics of the two wave packets and the overlap of those wave packets defines as the notion of electron vibrational coherence. Exactly the same picture we have now, where this cloning event introduces you a natural decoherence due to the multitude of the potential energy surfaces in your system. I will come back to this question later. So now our solution to this, and of course, everybody are developing the software, complicated software, which is addressing all those issues. That would be NEXMD code, which is released to public. And this code incorporates all those methodologies so we can compare them side to side. And our shortcut would be to use a semi-empirical Hamiltonian. Those Hamiltonians include only the valence set. However, we are able to get quantitatively correct the excited state description. For example, we can get excitonic effects, we can get charge dynamics, and over the years we have been incorporating various things in this framework, such as open shell dynamics and polaritonics. Overall, we are able to treat molecular systems of interest of up to 1,000 atoms and run non-adiabatic dynamics on the about 10 picosecond time limit, enabling this increase of complexity due to non-Born-Oppenheimer dynamics. So now, going back to the questions that Felix has been asking, so how well we can trust the trajectory methods and we can compare the surface hopping and Ehrenfest with more accurate cloning approach. So here, this is my very simple take on this. So now, if you are looking at the population evolution and non-radiative relaxation, then you can be off with surface hopping or Ehrenfest, provided they are improved, like with trivial crossing corrections, with decoherence corrections. Ehrenfest can be improved with the return of the detailed balance, like Oleg or Irene has been talking about. But if you would like to improve the quality of such simulations, you would rather look at the improvement of the underpinning electronic structure methodologies. because the electronic structure methodologies will allow you more accurate description of the potential energy surfaces, and in particular, improvement of gaps between states will allow you to obtain more accurate relaxation rates. So now we have been talking a lot about coherent dynamics. And if you would like to describe the coherent dynamics, Ehrenfest or surface hopping has those reminiscences of the coherences. But quantitative description can be only achieved with something like cloning approaches. Why? Because honestly, in Ehrenfest or surface hopping, we are not following, or we do not have a description of the vibrational wave packet. Whereas in something like cloning, we explicitly follow in the evolution of the vibrational wave function. So now let me go over a couple of examples. So my first example would be about intermolecular conical intersections. So now let me introduce the notion of the coherent electron vibrational dynamics. So over the years, we have been noticing a very ubiquitous pattern when describing photoexcited dynamics. We have seen that the excited state wave function is undergoing this slashing motion. So it has transient localization, transient delocalization, and again, transient localization, but in a different place. So there is a modulation of this motion of the wave packet by some vibrational excitations. And these vibrational excitations can be mapped back to the form of the non-adiabatic coupling vector. Remember that the direction of non-adiabatic coupling vector generally defines how the electronic energy is flowing into the vibrational degrees of freedom. Or in other words, it defines the specific vibrational excitation that would be photoexcited once the molecule relaxes from one excited state to another. So here you could see from those simple pictures that the pattern is very ubiquitous. A part of the molecular system is going into the expansion, and part is going to contract. And this expansion and asymmetric expansion and contraction will lead us to this transfer of the wave function where we have intermittent delocalization in the middle. So again, sort of like we have vibrations that modulate the potential energy well for the exciton, but remember, this would be a chicken and egg problem that our wave function, symmetry of the wave function, will define this non-adiabatic coupling vector, will define this vibrational excitation, and this vibrational excitation feed back into the wave function evolution so that we have a complex electron vibrational coherent dynamics. And you could see this transient localization, the localization across a broad range of the system. I'll just show you a simple movie. And this movie is showing you sort of like photoexcited dynamics in the dimer. So we have a slashing wave function, and in the middle, we have a transient delocalization of the wave function over the entire system. And I guess you have seen a very similar theme from the previous talks. What has been observed, for example, in the group of Johan, David Belgion have been talking extensively about this transient localization and so forth. But this would be an analog of what we see in the photoexcited dynamics. And Iran have been showing also the signatures of such type of footprints. So with that, of course, we are asking the question, how will this coherent dynamics help us to move the exciton from one place to another, whether sort of like we are closer to the delocalized model, to the band transport regime, or we are falling back to the hopping and to Brownian motion of the excitation. So this is my first example about intermolecular conical intersections. And we are well familiar what is going on for intramolecular conical intersections. For example, in the standard example of retinal molecules, the molecule is flipping the tail by initiating photochemical reactions. And by transferring the energy to the ground state. We have a sequence of events which allows us our eyes to see, and this is happening on the time scales of about 200 femtoseconds. So now, in the German group led by Christoph Linau and Antonietta Bisio, they have been looking at those signatures of conical intersection for various molecular systems. They have been interrogating these dynamics using two-dimensional electronic spectroscopy, which allows us to resolve in time how the dynamical coupling between different excited states behave, and if there are any signatures of coherent dynamics, and in particular, if there are any signatures of the passing through the conical intersection. So they have been looking at this oligomer. Again, so this acceptor-donor acceptor structure go back to the work in Santa Barbara, to the work of Guy Bazin, where they put these small molecules for very efficient organic photovoltaics at perhaps a decade ago. And we are looking here at the thin film. Okay, and they have been interrogating the lowest absorption peak of this thin film. And they have seen a very clear example that there is a conical intersection for the dynamics within this lowest absorption peak. And they ask the question, what are those essential states which are participating in this passage through the conical intersection? And in fact, whatever simulation you do, DFT or couple cluster or whatever, equation of motion couple clusters, then you will never find more than one relevant state for a single molecule. So our idea is that we have a strongly interacting molecules in the thin film, and those interacting molecules form as shared potential energy surfaces, and those potential energy surfaces, of course, cross and form intermolecular conical intersections. So let me briefly overview what they have seen in experiment. We are looking at the two-dimensional electronic spectroscopy, where we have a detection energy versus excitation energy, and we have a slices, different time scales with a very fine ultra-fast time resolution. So here, along the diagonal, we have something that is analogous to the standard transient absorption spectroscopy, where those peaks correspond to different electronic states. And you could see there are two electronic states. Here in two-dimensional spectroscopy, we have off-diagonal peaks, which are evolving in time, and those off-diagonal peaks are showing how those two electronic states are dynamically interacting. So if you summarize all this, you could clearly see those two states, and those two states are going into the crossing within like 40 femtoseconds. And after 40 femtoseconds, there is an intense vibrational dynamics induced, and then the dynamics is continuing on with this vibrational excitation after the passing of the conical intersection. And we could do with NEXMD our simulations by using a model system of two monomers in the H-aggregate. Here in H-aggregate, the upper state gains all the oscillator strands, and the lower state would be dark, and those are two essential states which are forming the conical intersections. And as expected, and as I shown you before, we are starting from the delocalized states, but once we are hitting the conical intersection within like 100 femtosecond, and this persists across the ensemble of the trajectories and nicely complement what we have seen in experiment. After we hit this conical intersection, there is a huge vibrational dynamics initiated because a lot of electronic energy is going into the vibrations. And then we have transient delocalization and localization of our excitations until the best degrees of freedom. And here I'm talking all about the external best, and also the best of vibrational modes present in the molecule will eat this energy, and the dynamics will stop with the wave function collapse into the self-trapping excitation. And of course, we see these dynamics across the ensemble of the trajectory. Here is the conical intersection and the enhanced electron vibrational dynamics, which is induced. So our vision is that those conical intersections which are created across the ensemble of molecules are ubiquitous, as ubiquitous as conical intersection in a single molecule. But compared to the single molecule where conical intersection sort of defines the outcome of photochemical reactions, for example, taking the example of the DNA damage. Here in the ensembles of molecules, intermolecular conical intersection defines the fate of the energy transfer. So they actively participate, and perhaps if we can design the methods how to control the dynamics through the conical intersection, we can direct with more precision the flow of energy. So let me go to the final topic. I guess I still have 5 minutes. And in the final topic, I will talk about experiments that can be done on the free electron lasers. And to me, this is a new experimental setup. And from the point of view, simple point of view of theorists, compared to experiment, which resolve, for example, the dynamics in time, and compared to microscopy. So spectroscopy in time, microscopy in space, the X files are able to resolve these dynamics both in space and time. And for example, this recent Nature Materials paper is showing the formation of polaronic state in perovskites and how the polaronic states develop and evolve with time. It's already like picosecond resolution. So here, in collaboration with the group of Shaul Mukamel, we have been looking at the dynamics of the dimer, and I've already shown you the movie how the excitation behave in the dimer. And what we want to do, we would like to model the true Karsh signal. And true Karsh signal is X-ray analog of the usual Karsh signal, except in true Karsh, the large energy would be the energy of the X-ray pulse, not the energy of the optical pulse. And the smaller energy would be the energy of the optical pulse, compared to the usual Karsh where the small energy would be vibrational energy. Otherwise, the framework is very similar, and this has been developed over the years in Shaul Mukamel's group. So our idea is that to model the dynamics in the true Karsh, ultrafast dynamics, starting from atomistic simulations toward experimental observables and see how the coherences are developing. So again, sort of like we have seen exactly the same photo-excited picture in those molecules, where we have the regions of the low coupling, we have the region of a strong non-adiabatic coupling, and we have a shuffling of the vibrational wave function between those regions, going through the intermittent delocalization, and there are specific vibrational modes which are coupled to these dynamics. So now the next question is, how can we calculate the true Karsh signal? And that's where the cloning dynamics comes handy, where we have the true electron vibrational wave functions and all those coefficients where we have electronic states, time-dependent state expanded into the adiabatic electronic states, and when we have the vibrational wave packet dynamics, and all those coefficients are able to calculate the electron vibrational density matrix between excited states. And of course, the off-diagonal elements of this density matrix reflect the developing coherence between two monomers. And then once we'll have the response signal, we could plug it everything in and calculate the signal using the true electron vibrational complete wave functions. So let me go over what we'll have as a result. Let's see what's going on in a simple one trajectory, one Ehrenfest trajectory which carries the vibrational wave packet. So now this would be experimentally observed true Karsh signal, and all those wiggles correspond to the evolution of the coherences in the system, and we can say that the coherence persists for over half of the picoseconds. And during these dynamics, we have a lot of crossing between those relevant states in the dimer, lower and upper states in the Davidov's pair. During this dynamics, you could see that off-diagonal elements is fluctuating. That's how the coherences are persistent in the system. We could see how the gap is behaving, kinetic energy, and many other things. Let's take a look at the other trajectories. In some trajectories, we have seen that there is almost no coherences in the beginning of the dynamics. However, once we hit the conical intersection, then those coherences develop. Why? Because we have the vibrational wave packet, and this wave packet is splitting into the two wave packet on two potential energy surfaces. But those wave packets keeps communication and keeps the overlap so that there is an electronic coherences between that is maintained between those two potential energy surfaces. Now, in another trajectory, we hit this potential energy surface and the coherences suddenly stop. Why? Because we have two new wave packets and those wave packets stop communicating. And frequently we have such results after we have multiple cloning events. So now let's look at the ensemble of the trajectory, because we experimentally measurable quantities are relevant only to the ensemble average. So that at the end of the day, we could see that the coherences appear and persist across the entire ensemble because all trajectories are persisting in phase. And the coherences are ubiquitous and can be observed on the picosecond timescales. So this is kind of interesting because all those simulations has been done for an ambient condition at room temperature in the presence of the thermal fluctuations. And those are soft systems, and thermal fluctuation distorts the structure quite a bit. But still, we have very nice development of the coherences, which is concomitant what people have been already observing in the dynamics of using two-dimensional electronic spectroscopy. However, this case, we are emphasizing very strongly, this is not just electronic degrees of freedom, but it's a concurrent dynamics of electronic and vibrational degrees of freedom. So let me jump into the conclusions. So I hope I showed you that non-adiabatic dynamic simulations are useful and they're highly complementary to experiment. And coherent vibronic dynamics is ubiquitous. And common feature would be transient localization and delocalization of the excited state wave function. Intermolecular conical intersection is a new notion which we believe is governing the energy transfer phenomena in the solid state. And finally, XFEL experiment can sensitively probe coherences, and TrueCar signal is one probe that we can calculate from theory, and TrueCars is free from the population contamination. So let me finally acknowledge, and we have a lot of people at Los Alamos developing this NEXMD and doing all those applications. Many postdocs and students. We have a great collaboration. It's a multi-institutional development with a group of Adrian Roydberg, Sebastian Fernandez Alberti in Argentina. We have been collaborating with Thomas Fraunheim in Bremen in Germany and with Shaul Mukamel. And there are a lot of developments which are attributed to different people like cloning to Dmitry Shalashilin and Mahov. And I didn't even talk about machine learning. So in experiment, there has been lots of experiments, in particular with Christoph Linau and Antonietta this year. With that, thank you so much for your attention.
Yes, thank you, Sergei, for staying on time. We have a couple of questions already in the chat, 3 already. So the first one is about representation, adiabatic versus diabatic. So the question is, I was wondering if the term intermolecular conical intersection refers to a new type of physics, or is it just a different language for discussing energy transfer? In a diabatic picture, one should say that the side energies of monomers are the same and that the coupling is small. In adiabatic picture, one calls it intermolecular conical intersection. But is it the same physical process?
Yeah, I guess this is the same physical process. Personally, I don't make any distinction between conical intersection, which is happening in the molecular systems. For example, you have a retinal which flips the tail. Again, sort of like you could represent the conical intersection essentially as 2 coordinates. And you could go switch from the adiabatic picture into the diabatic picture. And all those essential features would be preserved for the intermolecular conical intersections. So exactly the same description that has been developed for years for adiabatic and diabatic pictures that you could look at the work of the Yarkoni, how we can treat them. But I don't see any fundamental difference between those two descriptions.
Thank you. So the next question is about polarons. Very nice talk. Could you please comment on whether polaronic trapping is correctly described at the trajectory level? Gaussian wave packets should naturally do the job, I guess.
Yeah, so I believe this is exactly the point, that once you will have the Gaussian wave packet dynamics, you are not just describing the polaronic collapse or self-trapping of the excitons to this exciton polaron state, but you are capturing the dynamics when the formation of the polaron is a kind of coherent dynamics when the electronic energy is flowing from electronic degrees of freedom to the vibrations and back. And we don't have fundamental inconsistencies between electronic and vibrational degrees of freedom, such as you usually have something like in a vanilla surface hopping approach. So I do believe that the cloning gives us a pathway to describe this type of dynamics, whereas we are standing somewhere in between, sort of like fruit fly of the non-adiabatic dynamic simulations such as Ehrenfest or surface hopping, and high level of simulations that Irene presented to you on the MCTDH level. So the cloning I would put somewhere in between. We are retaining the essential physics.
And there's another question about cloning, but more from the methods point of view. During the cloning event, how is the phase of the Ehrenfest amplitudes controlled? Is coherence preserved between the wave packets during this process?
So absolutely. So now there are two aspects in the cloning. So we are passing the, let's say, the conical intersection, and we are looking at the Ehrenfest state. So the Ehrenfest state should be a superposition of multiple electronic states, and provided that the test of the potential energy surface is saying you need to clone. Now we are looking at the Ehrenfest amplitude. And if there is a significant amplitude on the both states, then we are cloning another trajectory on the upper state, saying that we are starting from the non-adiabatic, from the adiabatic Ehrenfest, whereas the second trajectory is continue down on the across all the rest of the states, so that the phase is preserved. Now it is important to properly clone the vibrational wave packet, which this cloning is also dependent on the Ehrenfest amplitude, and there is also the phase preservation factors and amplitude preservation factors that you clone, so that you will still retain the energy conservation and sort of like interference of phases.
And I have my own question about this method. So when you need to reproduce 1D or even 2D spectroscopic signals you showed, how complicated your vibrational wave function should be? How many Gaussians roughly?
This is an excellent question. So we have been trying to see when we converge in terms of vibrational wave packet in terms of trajectories, because you need as many trajectories as you could afford to represent the true vibrational wave packet. And also you need to converge with respect to the cloning. So sometimes you just cloning unnecessary, and this cloning will not add anything to your result. So in a very simple things, just to put it in contrast to the surface hopping, where the convergence is achieved generally, again, in quotes, at around 1,000 of trajectories, take it or leave it. Here in cloning, we could start with about 200 to 300 trajectories. And on the way, we can allow up to like 5 cloning events to reach the quasi-convergence of the wave function. So altogether, we don't need much more than 1,000 of end trajectories and maybe like 200 to 300 of starting trajectories. Again, this is of course system specific.
Yeah, not that much more expensive.
No, not that much more expensive. I would put equal sign between surface hopping and Ehrenfest. Remember that in Ehrenfest, we need the gradients across all the excited states. And I would put a factor of 5 to 10 in front of this expense. This is our price to go to the cloning.
So I think there are no more questions, so thank you. And let's continue. Last but not least,